Hi, folks. It's time for my lecture on the Epic of Gilgamesh. Um, we'll ultimately focus on Tablet 11 of the story, which deals with the Great Flood, but I'll also talk a little bit about what in the story leads up to that, the origin of Gilgamesh, some of the parallels between Gilgamesh and the Old Testament, and some of the characters in the story. Um, some of them were in Tablet 11. Some of them appeared earlier, and I'll just mention them briefly. Um, but I hope you find this interesting. It's the oldest kind of surviving piece of written literature um, in the world, um, predating the Bible by around 2,000 years loosely. Um, so it's kind of fascinating from that perspective in terms of how old it is historically, etc. So the story comes out of the ancient culture of Sumeria from the Sumerian people, um, and specifically the setting is the city of Ur, which does still exist. The central location for the story is in what is now Iraq. Um, it's been a little tricky for researchers, anthropologists, historians, etc., to study the area. Certainly with the last few decades with all the unrest in Iraq, etc. But they have been able to do some restoration and research, etc., to try and kind of understand. Especially does the location in Iraq where existed. Um, how can we relate that to the story of Gilgamesh? Um, we know of Gilgamesh through these tablets, as I mentioned before, on which the story is written. We don't have it completely. Some of the tablets are broken. There's some things that are missing, etc. So again, historians and anthropologists have had to kind of fill in a little bit where the pieces are missing. It's written in the ancient form of writing that you probably heard of before called cuneiform. And so obviously you have to be one of those relatively few, I would imagine, experts in the world in cuneiform, obviously, to be able to read the story. So let me show you a second here, something of the location and one of the tablets. So first here is the ziggurat in Ur. Ziggurat were somewhat like pyramids. They were usually stepped, sort of terraced, whereas pyramids are typically smooth-sided. Pyramids, as we know, are kind of pointy at the top. Ziggurats tended to be more flat at the top. They served different kinds of purposes, symbolic and practical purposes, right? Ziggurats, obviously being raised as they are, can provide a certain degree of safety. Their kind of spiritual significance is reflected in the fact that they're high above the ground, and obviously all the time and effort that's put into building them. As you can see here, this has been partly reconstructed. You can see kind of the middle part hasn't been constructed. You can kind of see what it looked like. But it has been partly reconstructed to look a little bit like it does, like it did at the time that it was built. There is a picture, I forget which, if it's in Perry chapter 1 or Perry chapter 2, of the ziggurat of Ur. It's another picture that shows it. I think in its more pre-reconstruction sort of phase. But so this is Gilgamesh's city. This is the city in which he was king in Ur. I'll also share with you here a photograph of one of the tablets, so you can see what it looks like. Again, the cuneiform writing on the tablet, You can kind of see, you can see it's not in perfect shape, but again, there's enough of the story um, to have something relatively coherent that you can kind of make out of it. Um, and so there's a lot that people have been able to learn about these ancient Sumerian people from these tablets and from the story of Gilgamesh. Um, these kinds of stories, origin stories and stories of a people's history, are obviously very important to them, right? They were kind of things that are passed along the generations. Um, more modern civilizations have various kinds of modern historical and scientific means of understanding their origins and their history, right? Where we came from, etc. These ancient cultures obviously didn't have that. That's why mythology was so important to them. That's why these stories were so important. These origin stories are typically a mix of fact and fiction. Um, it's particularly interesting in thinking about Gilgamesh as a story about the people of Ur and Sumerian culture. Um, what elements of this might be true, might have some factual basis, and what elements of this might be more fictional. Um, and in particular, in thinking about this great flood um, that is recounted in Tablet 11 of Gilgamesh. There are, in fact, several civilizations in this area of the world, in the Middle East, loosely speaking, that tell of a great flood that essentially wiped out, the vast majority of people and animals, etc. And Gilgamesh is interesting in particular because of how it mirrors, in some ways, the story of Noah in the Bible, in the Old Testament. Um, the question is, because this great flood story seems to be shared by some different peoples, what does that mean? What is its origin? Where did it come from? Um, did it have one source? And then it kind of, broke off into the different people's, versions of it as they heard the story. Was there some kind of an event that it actually chronicles? Is that part of the fact of the story of Gilgamesh, that this flood really did occur? Again, really interesting to think about. There have been people who have tried to study this. Um, and in this class, I typically show a National Geographic documentary called Divining Noah's Flood that you might want to check out, with some anthropologists and historians that actually travel in Iraq. This was actually during part of the Iraq War, so they had to be very careful. One of them had served in the military before, to try and see if there were certain things that they could learn about this area of the world where this story supposedly took place. Um, One of the things that we find in these origin stories, and you can see this in some Native American origin stories, are that events that took many years, sometimes hundreds of years, changes in the culture and the society, etc., are often in these stories kind of telescoped down into a much shorter period of time. So something that may have taken several hundred years might take, in a story might take 10 years or less, whatever, um, because you're trying to tell this obviously very long, involved story. So there are people who believe, in fact, that the Great Flood did occur. And the Great Flood was actually a function of the warming of the earth through its natural cycles, um, whereby this part of the world where the story takes place was, in fact, flooded. Now, it's more likely to have been a more gradual flood, right? As water levels gradually rise as the earth, warms, and looking specifically at this part of the world. And that it may have taken, quite a number of years for this to happen. And when it happened, the peoples had to move, away from where the water was advancing on them. And then perhaps this took, again, decades and decades to actually take place, and where these people were having to move, but that was telescoped into, 40 days and 40 nights or something, some approximation of that in these origin stories. Right? So just because there's some things that we can't explain kind of scientifically, about, let's say, Noah's flood or some of the floods, other flood stories, um, there are possible explanations that involve having to rethink the way time is dealt with in these stories, right? Where again, an event, a really event that took many, many years, telescoped down into a smaller time period. One of the interesting things is that some of the research that was done and has been done in this part of the world, and it was even done, um, right near, again, where the story of Gilgamesh took place. This is desert now, dry desert land, right? Like much of Iraq. If you actually dig down into the sand and down into the earth, um, to about the time period in which people believe the story of Gilgamesh, had its origins, you can find very strong evidence that that was once covered with water. There are all kinds of shells. There are things that show that there was food that was available, plant life. Um, so there had been water in this area, and the amount of water may have changed over time. It may have been swampland at one point or marshes, and then just became completely covered with water. Um, but So that kind of fits in with this idea that a lot of people have been sort of trying to think about and do some research on and pursue. And of course, there are all kinds of competing theories about what's fact and what's fiction here. But there is at least some evidence that one of the things that could have happened was that this was a very long event, again, telescoped into a short period of time. But you can see here what this tablet looks like. I'm going to give some background on the story, give some specifics on Gilgamesh, um, what we know about the character of Gilgamesh as he's portrayed in the story, and just again, a real brief overview of the story up through Tablet 11, and then I'll focus in on Tablet 11 specifically. So here we have, this was a piece on the characters of Gilgamesh, characters of the story. As I also know that I spoke of previously, if you go on YouTube, you can find all kinds of retellings of the story, cartoon versions of the story, film school or student versions of the story, home movie versions of the story. They're really kind of fascinating to see how people have interpreted the story and how they try to tell it through these kind of home movies and things. So you might want to check out some of those. Some of those are, pretty entertaining. Some of them are kind of funny, even when they're not supposed to be funny, just because of these kind of cheesy kind of home movie kind of things. But some of them are actually pretty interesting. So you might want to just check those out. So Gilgamesh, the sovereign of the fabulous city of Uruk, right, or as I mentioned, son of Lugbanda and Ninsun. The strength of his body frightens the bravest and makes him invincible. And you can tell by the way this kind of cartoonish portrayal of Gilgamesh that he was a big muscular guy. He's beautiful, proud, and arrogant. He wasn't the best king in the way the story is sort of told. He wasn't really doing what he was supposed to be doing as king, and we'll find out why here. He has an enormous power, and his army is feared by the nations, but he's a tyrant who scares his subjects until he discovers that he will only find fame and glory fighting next to his friend Enkidu against really superior enemies. If we are going to die, let's do it as heroes, he reflects. Right? Very similar to what we saw obviously many years later in ancient Greece, the same kind of warrior sort of mentality. So who are these different characters? I'm going to show you a few of the other characters here. Enkidu is very important. Enkidu was this human friend of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, again, was part human and part god. You might call him a demigod, but demigod usually suggests 50-50 mix, and it wasn't that way. Gilgamesh is supposedly 2/3 god, 1/3 man. Nonetheless, he is not immortal. And in the story, he is seeking immortality. And he's feeling like he's caught between two worlds, right? Because he's 2/3 god, 1/3 human. This friend Enkidu kind of helps him to come to terms with the human side of who he is. But he really struggles to do that ultimately. So here are some of the other characters. So Gilgamesh, I mentioned, main character. Enkidu, the main companion of Gilgamesh. Shamhat, a temple prostitute, who plays a role in the story. Utnapishtim is this story's version of Noah. He's the one who's kind of tipped off that this flood is going to be coming and is told to build a boat that's described very much like Noah's Ark. Utnapishtim's wife is important here too. She kind of takes pity on Gilgamesh. Urshanabi, guardian of the stone things. Urshanabi plays the role in this story of the boatman, right? Gilgamesh in the story is having to travel from one realm to another because he's ultimately trying to find Utnapishtim. And so there's this boat, of course, that has to take you across the water between these realms, right? There's always got to be a boatman in these stories. Urshanabi is the boatman in this story. I mentioned that there are other gods that play a role here. One that's not listed here is Enlil, spelled Enlil, Enlil, Enlil. He's one of the gods, and he's the one who kind of tips off Gilgamesh that this flood is coming and that he should build this boat. Excuse me, he tips off Utnapishtim that he should build this boat. So Enlil ultimately let's see, there was Enlil, Ea, Naruto. Actually, it was actually Ea who told Utnapishtim to build the boat. Enlil is the one who makes Utnapishtim immortal. No human was supposed to survive the flood. And when this Utnapishtim ends up surviving, Enlil is the one who makes him immortal. Right? So either you die with the other humans or you have to be made immortal like the gods because they're the only ones who are supposed to kind of survive. So Enlil is actually the one who makes Utnapishtim immortal. And again, there are a number of different other gods here. And again, the story is kind of confused because they don't have all the pieces to it, etc. So if I'm a little confusing here, I apologize. The gods decided to create the Great Flood in the Gilgamesh version of the Great Flood because the human beings had multiplied too much and were making too much noise, and they were keeping the gods from sleeping. Right, so you can sense that these are much more of a pagan gods, right, than the kind of monotheistic God we have in the Old Testament, right? These pagan gods obviously have many more human characteristics to them, right? In ancient Greek and Roman literature, they often seem like it's almost soap opera characters, right? They're always competing with each other, a lot of jealousy, even when within families, lots of jealousy between mothers and daughters, That plays a major role in Virgil's Aeneid, which we'll be reading here very soon. The story of the founding of Rome. So they've got these, human traits about them. And so the gods are obviously being, we might say, somewhat petty here in wanting to destroy human beings, destroy the because they're too noisy and they keep them from sleeping. Trying to make sure I've got everything. All right, so a little more about Gilgamesh. He has some characteristics that are more godlike and some characteristics that are more, you might say, human-like or reflect human beings. So in terms of the godlike characteristics, remember he's 2/3 God, 1/3 human. A fierce warrior, right? He saw the lions around him glorying in life. Then he took his axe in his hand, he drew his sword from his belt, and he fell upon them like an arrow from the string, and struck and destroyed and scattered them. He's courageous. When Gilgamesh saw them, he shielded his eyes for the length of a moment only. Then he took courage and approached. He shows great love for others. For Enkidu, I loved him dearly. Together we endured all kinds of hardships. On his account, I have come, for the common lot of man has taken him. Enkidu is kind of sent by the gods to help Gilgamesh deal with his suffering. This suffering is causing him, again, not to be a very good leader of his people, not to be a very good king. So he's got to, obviously, in this story, learn about how to become a better king to his people, a better leader to his people. And so Enkidu sort of plays a role. Unfortunately, Enkidu ends up dying in the story. And after they had become friends and Gilgamesh seemed like he was happier, Enkidu dies. Gilgamesh is all by himself again. And again, this is when he really decides he needs to find Utnapishtim. Some other characteristics here, just go over briefly. Some of his human characteristics, right? His physical appearance. He looks like a human being. If you are the Gilgamesh that seized and killed the bull of heaven, who killed the watchman of the forest and killed the lions in the passes of the mountain, why are your cheeks so starved and why is your face so drawn? So his physical appearance, and he looks like a mortal. He looks like he can suffer and experience pain and potentially die, right? Because he's mortal. He can be weak. Look at him now, the strong man who had everlasting life. Even now, the mists of sleep are drifting over him. He can be careless. It rose out of the water and snatched it away, and immediately it sloughed off its skin and returned to the well. We'll talk about this in a little bit here. It has to do with Utnapishtim and in particular his wife taking pity on Gilgamesh near the end of the story here. And one more piece that kind of gives the characteristics here of Gilgamesh. Can't control his emotions. Wept over Enkidu when Enkidu dies, right? He really feels all alone. What am I going to do, etc. He can be afraid. He's afraid of death. Because I'm afraid of death, will go as best as I can to find Utnapishtim, who they call the faraway, for he has entered the assembly of the gods. And again, this is where you need to cross the water. Shinabi, the boatman, needs to take you. He's not supposed to do this, so he gets punished for bringing Gilgamesh over to the assembly of the gods, where Utnapishtim now lives, since he has become immortal. In these mountain passes, long ago I saw lions. I was afraid, and I lifted my eyes to the moon. I prayed, and my prayers went up to the gods. So now, O moon god, Sin, protect me. So you can see his human characteristics here that he has, as well as the more godlike characteristics. And this just kind of gives you an overview of some of the characters I've already kind of described here. We have Gilgamesh in the middle, Uruk's semi-divine king, proud and hungry for fame, which is leading him to be a very severe ruler, as is the fact that he just feels out of place, right? He's not fulfilled, right? He feels weak as an immortal. And we know when people do that, when they feel weak, is often when they strike out against other people and take advantage of whatever power they do have. A close friend here, again, Enkidu, curbs the king's appetites with his strength and wisdom, again, to help Gilgamesh become a better ruler until Enkidu is dies. He ends up killing one of these gods that takes the form of an animal, and a curse is put on him. So Enkidu dies. Utanapishtim again, the Noah of the story, who's granted immortality. Urshanabi, again, the boatman. Siduri, I'm not going to talk a whole lot about Siduri, goddess of wine and wisdom. Again, you find similar kinds of gods in these various mythologies, and to portray different kinds of human characteristics, things that human beings are interested in, things that are important to them, the values that they hold, etc. So you have the goddess of wine and wisdom, like you do in the other mythologies. Ishtar, jealous god of sexual love, plays a role in the story with Enkidu. And then there's Shamhat, temple priestess, believes sexual love is a form of worship. Again, that's the kind of thing you're going to see in pagan religions, right? Is sexual love being treated differently than it is, for example, in the Bible, and later monotheistic religions, when sexual love again is related more to the body, to the more inferior part of who we are, whereas worship is a function of the soul and mind, etc., that higher part of who we are. And again, part of that you can see in Plato. So let me talk more specifically then about tablet 11 of the story, the one that I asked you to read. I did include the study guide, I think, in the folder, and some things from the other tablets. Some of that story I've already kind of told you what happens there, right? That we have Gilgamesh, not a very good king. He's kind of tortured soul. He's mean and nasty, not a very good leader. The gods send him Enkidu to try to tame him and make him a better leader. Enkidu ends up dying after a curse is put on him from killing this god who took animal form. And Gilgamesh is lonely again. He wants to find Utanapishtim. He wants to have immortality. It's the only way he thinks he can kind of really go on with his life. So in tablet 11, and I'm just going to go through this and point out some interesting similarities between this and the story of the flood in the Bible. Just a sort of a general comment. You'll see the number 7 recurring over and over as having kind of a pagan spirituality kind of significance. Just as we see 7 in the Bible, it's also having some great significance. So this is when the story kind of starts here, where Gilgamesh has made his way to Utanapishtim. Urshanabi has helped him to cross over the water to where the gods dwell, and he finds Utanapishtim, the flood survivor that he was looking for. Utanapishtim talks still a little bit about Gilgamesh, about what has happened to him, and tells him his story of how he became immortal. Right? Utanapishtim spoke to Gilgamesh, saying, "I will reveal to you, Gilgamesh, a thing that is hidden, a secret of the gods I will tell you." And again, goes on to tell his story about being told to make this boat. And on the bottom of page 1 of tablet 11, he says, "Tear down the house and build a boat, abandon wealth, and seek living beings. Spurn possessions and keep alive living beings. Make all living beings go up into the boat which you are to build. Its dimensions must measure equal to each other. Its length must correspond to its width." If you see pictures of the ark as it's kind of described, Noah's Ark, you can see that it's, if not exactly the same, typically portrayed as almost being as wide as it is long. length was correspond to its roof it over like the Apsu. I understand and spoke to my lord Ea. Again, it was Ea who was the one who was telling him to build this boat. I think feeling bad that the gods were going to be creating this flood and killing the human beings. And there's some other specifics he kind of goes into here. And he's talking about having built the boat. The children carried pitch to the boat. That's what you put in between the wood planking on the boat to keep it waterproof. Its walls were each 10 times 12 cubits in height, the cubit, that ancient form of measurement. The sides of its top were equal length, 10 times its cubit each. Laid out the interior, he talks about it. I provided it with 6 decks, thus dividing it into 7 levels. There's that number 7. How much bitumen he took with him, the number of casks of vegetable oil and things that they would need while they were spending their time on this boat. Page 3, the boat was finished by sunset. The launching was very difficult. They had to keep carrying a runway of poles front to back until 2/3 of it had got into the water. A runway of poles. Runway is the side of one of these boats. And they're talking about poles that would use, right, to move the boat along. And one way you do this is with these really long poles. You walk the length of the boat as the pole is in the water, and in walking the length of the boat, you move it that far, give it that much momentum, and kind of moving it forward. Talks about all the living beings that I had loaded on it. I had all my kith and kin go up into the boat. We don't really know exactly what happens to them. We know we definitely know his wife survives, right? We know that Utnapishtim's wife survives. All the beasts and animals of the field, and the craftsmen I had go up. Again, the question of their survival is kind of a mystery here. And how will they get food? This is Shamhash, which is who's Gilgamesh's protector, and talking about leaving loads of bread will shower down in the evening, a rain of wheat, that they'll be able to have for food. And then he says, I went into the boat and sealed the entry. Obviously then talks about all the water coming up. The wind is blowing. The gods were frightened by the flood, the gods themselves, and retreated, ascending to the heaven of Anu. The gods were cowering like dogs, crouching by the outer wall. Ishtar shrieked like a woman in childbirth. And so, describing what this was like. 6 days and 7 nights came the wind and flood, the storm flattening the land. When the 7th day arrived, the storm was pounding. The flood was a war, as he kind of portrays it here. And again, some of this is partial because I'm skipping here. Some of it's partial just because the text itself, unfortunately, is partial. Talks about human beings as had turned to clay. Clay represents weakness, frailty, mortality. Talk about having a foot of clay. We'll see that portrayal appearing in our later one of our later readings, actually in the Aeneid. The terrain was flat as a roof. Everything's just water. He opens the vent for fresh air. So as they're waiting for the water to go down, he's talking about the boat being lodged in Mount Nimush, which would be the parallel with Ararat, as many people claim is where the Noah's Ark landed. And so he's counting off the days, and just as portrayed in Noah's Ark, they release birds to try and see if there's any land yet, right? If the bird doesn't come back, it means it couldn't find any land. They should stay on the boat. If the bird doesn't come back, it means it must have found a way to a place to land, and it must mean that there's land somewhere. The water is receding. When a 7th day had arrived, I set forth a dove and released it. The dove went off, but came back to me. And again, the significance of the dove and what the dove represents too. And in the Bible. No perch was visible, so it circled back to me. I sent forth a swallow and released it. The swallow went off, but came back to me. No perch was visible, so it circled back to me. I sent forth a raven and released it. Ravens also have a major place in mythology and stories of various kinds. Most famously, right, in Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. The raven went off and saw the water slither back. It eats, it scratches, it bobs, but does not circle back to me. Then I sent out everything in all directions and sacrificed a sheep. So, the land now is such that they can get out of the boat. I offered incense in front of the mountain ziggurat. 7 and 7 cult vessels I put in place, all these references to 7. And Leal then arrives. He saw the boat and became furious. He was filled with rage. Who is it that told him to build this ark? Nobody was supposed to survive. Where did the living being escape? No man was to survive the annihilation. So he's really angry here. And this is where, because Utnapishtim survived, that he makes him immortal. So now Gilgamesh has learned how Utnapishtim became immortal. How could you bring about a flood without consideration, charge the violation to the violator, charge the offense to the offender, but be compassionate, lest mankind be cut off, be patient, lest they be killed. And so, being criticized both for causing the flood and then being criticized for making Utnapishtim immortal. And Leo went up inside the boat and grasping my hand made me go up. He had my wife go up and kneel by my side. He touched our forehead and standing between us, he blessed us. Previously, this is him speaking, previously Utnapishtim was a human being, but now let Utnapishtim and his wife become like us, the gods. Let Utnapishtim reside far away at the mouth of the rivers. Right. Again, this is where we have Urshanabi, the boatman, having to go across where the river, where the gods dwelled. To do this, he must. He tells. This is then when Utnapishtim talks about how Gilgamesh could potentially achieve immortality. And it's parallel in a way to what Utnapishtim himself experienced with the 7 days and 7 nights of the deluge, as they call it, of water. And says that the Gilgamesh needs to, he says, you must not lie down for 6 days and 7 nights to become immortal. So Gilgamesh tries to do this. And he thinks he's going to make it. Look there, the youth who wanted eternal life. Sleep like a fog blew over him. Oops, he's not going to make it. His wife said to Utnapishtim the far away, touch him, let the man awaken, let him return safely by the way he came, let him return to his land by the gate through which he left. And then Utnapishtim's not quite sure that that's a good idea yet. They finally awake. Gilgamesh awakes and they explain to him what happened. He thinks that he had just fallen asleep just for a second, but he had actually had, he hopes, made it the 7 days and 7 nights. But what they had done to count the days was that a loaf of bread was baked for each day. And each day, each loaf of bread would get older looking, and eventually you'd see it starting to sprout mold or whatever over the course of the days. And they show him the bread and said, we baked this bread 1 a day, and look what happened. Here, look at how many loaves. You can count the number of loaves, and it will show how long you were sleeping. You didn't make it. The 7th, at that instant, you awoke, he says. So it looks like Gilgamesh is going to go away empty-handed here because he didn't make it. They are willing to give him these new royal robes, worthy of him, dress him to be like a king, and send him back to Uruk ultimately, right? So they agreed to do that, hoping he will start acting more kingly, that maybe he has at least acquired some wisdom through what he's been through, even though he has not achieved immortality. Utnapishtim's wife becomes, again, feels bad for him and says, let's do something to help him out at least. And then Utnapishtim spoke to Gilgamesh saying, Gilgamesh, you came here exhausted and worn out. What can I give you so you can return to your land and be the kind of king you need to be? I will disclose to you a thing that is hidden, Gilgamesh. And here, clearly, the tablet is incomplete, and some of the words are missing. So he says, I will tell you. He's going to tell him this kind of secret. There is a plant like a box thorn, whose thorns will prick your hand like a rose. If your hands reach that plant, you will become a young man again. So he's not going to achieve immortality. He will become young again, which will give him the energy, the opportunity to become the kind of wise king that he should have been, right? And to maybe take some pride in who he is as king, right? And so the way it's described, there are lots of different opinions about what this might look like. If it's coral that's being described here, or a sea anemone of some kind, who knows? They're able to find this plant. Gilgamesh spoke to Urshanabi, the ferryman, who's got to take him back, obviously, saying, Urshanabi, this plant is a plant against decay, by which a man can attain his survival. I will bring it to Uruk and have an old man eat the plant to test it. You got to, the kings always do that, right? You have somebody else try it first. The plant's name is The Old Man Becomes a Young Man. Long name, right? Those kind of descriptive names are very common in a lot of these early civilizations. The names were not just random. Names, were descriptive. They were to tell you about the person, right? You see that in, for example, Native American names in this country. Sometimes you have to, earn your name, or it's given to you by your behavior when you're young to be descriptive of it, that sort of thing. They're able to find this plant and are going to take it back. And then I mentioned in one of the previous slides that I showed where it said that Gilgamesh is like a human being. He makes mistakes. He makes errors. He is not careful like he should be. And so one night when they stopped for the night, when they saw a spring with its cool waters, this is page 9, when Gilgamesh was bathing and went down to the water, a snake smelled the fragrance of the plant, silently came up and carried off the plant. While going back, it sloughed off its casing. Right? The snake is kind of like a serpent, lion of the ground is how it's sometimes described. So a snake basically steals the plant, and not only does he steal it, they actually see that it worked because the snake sloughed off its skin. Right, the sloughing off its skin representing it's sort of being young again. It's now got fresh skin on the outside. It sloughed off the old skin, and so there's the sort of and I guess the assumption here is it kind of only works once, or when the snake went off with it. Later, it is described as kind of a lion of the ground. So Gilgamesh presumably returns to his city, hopefully again wiser, not immortal, but hopefully becoming a better ruler like he should have been in the first place. So again, I really think it's a fascinating story. For fun, you might want to check out some of the different kind of home movie film, cartoon versions of the story of Gilgamesh. Um, it was several years the last time I actually checked to see how many there were, and I'm sure there are more since then. Um, I think there probably actually are some cartoon series and things like that that have adopted characters like Gilgamesh, in their stories, and maybe even some modern video games that have a Gilgamesh character in them. I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case either. Um, so that's the Epic of Gilgamesh. Let me know if you have any questions about that. We do have coming up our next reading. So please be prepared for that. You'll see I'm going to be doing quite a few lectures here coming up. That's just because of the kind of reading that we're going to be doing, that I think it would be helpful for you to have some more lectures coming up. But just kind of briefly looking ahead here. So we've got Virgil coming up next. We've got 4 days for Virgil's Aeneid. Again, it's the story of the founding of Rome. It's essentially in chapters, but they call them books. So book 1 and 2 are due for the 23rd. So due for Friday. Please, over the next few days, try to get chapter 4 read. I would say if you could have chapter 4 read of the Perry book by the end of the weekend, that would be good. And check over the PowerPoint that's there as well. And books 1 and 2, there's also an introduction in the book that I recommend reading. And also a document that I've made available to you in the folder on the Greek and Roman gods and goddesses. So you can compare the Roman gods we're going to read about in Virgil with the Greek gods that we read about in our previous readings. The story of Virgil, again, is Virgil's story of the Aeneid really is fascinating. Again, the story of the founding of Rome. Somebody was asked to tell this origin story about Rome and where it came from, by Augustine, and turned him down because they were worried about coming up with a story of the origin of Rome, the place that he was, emperor of, that would displease him and that they would suffer punishment because of that. So people were, he asked some people that weren't willing to write this. Virgil said he was willing to do it. And his brilliant way of going about this was by doing it through a story that clearly has fictional elements to it and involves the gods and goddesses, etc. And it does a number of things that to make the emperor happy. It shows that he actually is descended from the gods. Ultimately, it shows that the Roman people, going way back in their history, were a good people, a courageous people, etc. And what the story basically will do is take Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the story of the fall of Troy, and then the story of Odysseus' kind of searching voyage, and it'll kind of recast that in Roman terms. And we'll see that the fall of Troy, Aeneid and some other people are able to survive the fall of Troy, and they then get in these ships and go sailing because Aeneid was told that his destiny, his fate, was to found a city that would be the precursor to Rome. But he has to undertake these very difficult travels. Many people will die. It's going to be a trying journey for him. All his way, he'll be manipulated by the gods. Some who want to help him to achieve his goal faster. Some want to make it, him achieve it slower or stop it if they can. And we'll talk about that. The relationship between what are called the fates and the gods are really important here. And I'll talk about that a little bit and also in my first lecture. So please read the introduction, books 1 and 2, and the document that will compare and contrast the Roman and Greek gods and goddesses, so you can keep those names straight. hope you found this lecture helpful. And I'll be again posting another one really soon for the Aeneid. And hope your rest of your week is good and you have a good weekend. And I'll see you again next time to talk about the Aeneid.